Hello everyone, and welcome to part 5 of building a simple Dropbox clone. We're currently missing one key part in our app, and that's uploading files. So let's get started. We'll be using Supabase for storing our files. We should already have our app properly configured with Supabase if you followed part 1. Similar to our DB functions, I'll create a new file under the utils folder. I'm going to call that supapload.ts. I'll import the create client function from the Supabase JavaScript library. Also, we'll need our fresh file interface. I'll create a const called client, which will create our Supabase client by using the create client function and passing it the environment variables for the Supabase URL and key. Our first function will handle the file upload process. I'll call it upload file. This will return a promise of a string or undefined in the case that there was an error with uploading the file. It'll take a blob, which represents the file, an ID, which represents the ID of that file, and a parent folder, which represents the ID of the parent folder for that file. To upload a file, it's very easy. We use the Supabase storage client by calling storage on our const client. We tell it which bucket we're interested in. In part 1, we created a folders bucket. So that's the one we're going to use. And finally, we call the upload function on that bucket by passing it the path and the file we're interested in. So the path would be the parent folder ID /ID of the file. This will return an error or data. In the case that we have an error, we're simply going to console log it for now. And finally, we'll return the path of that data. So if there was no errors, this should return a string. Otherwise, this should just be undefined. The other function we're interested in is getting the public URL for the file that we uploaded on Supabase. This way, we can use that to show an embedded page in our web app. We'll create a public URL function, which takes in a fresh file and returns a string, a promise of a string. Similar to how we upload, we would call the storage client, then we select the bucket we're interested in, and finally we just call the getPublicURL function by passing it the path, which is the parent folder ID /the file ID. This will give us the data, and we want the public URL for that data, which we return. Our logic is ready to be used. So let's create an API endpoint that will make use of this upload file function. Inside of our routes folder, I'll create a new folder called API, inside of which I'll create an API called upload.tsx. This will handle calling Supabase and, on success, storing the file metadata in Deno KV. The reason we're creating an API in the first place is that in our file upload component, we can't actually use Deno KV here, or we can't actually use the Supabase client, since this is more client-side code. So we need to do all that either inside of a handler, similar to how we handle saving a folder. Inside of the layout, we have the create modal, and whenever this is called, it makes a post request, which is handled inside of our routes by the post handlers. So we'll need to do something a bit similar. In our case, we're going to just create an API. We don't need to display anything, and this API will handle saving the file and saving it on Supabase side. So if we head back to our upload API. We'll first import the handlers type from Fresh. We need our Fresh file interface and the save file DB function and upload file from Supabase that we just created. We can then export our handler. We then create our async post handler. This handler will receive a form data in the request. So first thing we do is get that form. The form data will contain a file, which will be a blob. This will be the file that we're uploading. It'll also contain the ID of that file, as well as the name and the parent folder. With all that information, we can call the upload file to upload this file to Supabase. So we pass it the blob, the file ID, and the parent folder ID. This will return a path, which is either a string or undefined. So in the case that it's undefined, we return an error response of 500. Otherwise, we create a fresh file object, passing it the ID, name, parent folder, and save that to Deno KV. We finish by returning a 200 response saying that the file was uploaded successfully. So our API endpoint that interacts with Supabase is ready. Now we can use it when we make use of our file upload component. So if we head over to our file upload component, we'll notice that the handle drop and on upload file are currently doing nothing. All they do is console log the file. So we'll change that to create a form data, send that to our API, and then refresh the page. So let's get rid of the console log for both of them. Before we can add the logic to it, we currently have no clue what folder we're in. Since this component is used in the layout component, we're going to need that information for specifying the parent folder ID whenever we save or upload a file. To deal with this, let's create a file upload props interface, which will hold the current folder ID information as a string. We then get that props as a parameter for our component. Now, instead of console logging the file like we were doing earlier, we're going to first update our function so that it is async. Then we're going to assign the file to a variable, which we'll call file. We want to create a form data and pass it along to our API endpoint. To do so, we can create a form data object, and then we append all the different information that we need to it. So we'll append the file by passing it the file. We also need the ID, which will be randomly generated. We need the name, which we can get from the file itself by calling file.name. We then need the parent folder ID, which we can get from our props that we just added. Finally, we create the URL for our API request, which is API/upload, which represents in our routes API and the file name upload. We then make use of the fetch function to make an API call, passing it the URL. The method is post, credentials same origin, and the body is the form data that we just created. Based off of the response, which can be a 200 or a 500, in the case that the response is equal to 200, we're going to reload the page. Now you could add better error handling to maybe display an error message if something failed, but for our case, we're just going to refresh the page whenever a file upload is successful. For the upload file, we basically do the exact same thing. We change that to an async method. The only difference that we have is for the on drop, we're getting it from the data transfer object. Here we're getting it from the target. object. But the rest of the code is exactly the same thing. We create a form data, we append all the information that we need, we then create our URL constant, we call fetch on it, and if it's successful, we reload the page. So we added all the logic for our file upload component. Now, since we added this new props, which is expected, we need to make sure that we pass that information wherever we're using file upload props. So if we head over to layout, we should see an error since file upload is expecting a current folder, and we can get that from the props.folder data. And since current folder expects a string and not a folder or null, we can then check if props.folder is defined. Let's get the props.folder.id. Otherwise, let's just use home since we know we're in the home page. All right, now if we hit save, go to our app, refresh, we should see everything still works exactly the same. Now let's try and upload a file. I'm uploading a txt file. If I drag and drop it, we should see the upload was successful. The storage to Deno KV was successful. We refresh the page, and now we can see my recipes showing up. The thing that's missing now is that we don't have the route to display our files. So let's add that. I'll create a folder under routes called file and a file called ID with square brackets tsx, similar to the one that we have in folders. I'll import a few things. So we'll have the page props and handlers from Fresh, the navbar component, our Fresh file interface, the get file function from our DB functions, and get public URL from our Supabase functions. We'll create an interface called file display. This will represent the Fresh file and the Supabase public URL. The file will be fetched from Deno KV, and the URL will be from the get public URL call to Supabase. We then export a handler that will use this file display interface. We only have a get handler. We get the file ID from the context since we're inside of a dynamic route. So ID with square brackets means that we have access to a parameter called ID. We call the get file function to get this file from our database. If this file doesn't exist, we render not found. Otherwise, we get the public URL for that file. We then create the file display object by passing it the file from Deno KV and the public URL that we just got, and we call the render function by passing it this object. We now have access to this data inside of our page component. So if we create a page component called file page, which takes in a page props of type file display, we can return a JSX element. First, we'll display the navbar, and second is a div that's going to contain the file name, which we get from our props.data.file.name, and second is a div that contains an embedded HTML tag, which will display the Supabase URL, which we can get from props.data.url. So with this already, we can hit save. If we head back to our browser, hit refresh. Now if I click to my recipe.txt, we should see we're seeing the file name of my content, and then we're seeing the actual content of my recipe being displayed. I downloaded an image from Pixabay, and if we try and drag and drop that, we should see that we have a new image. Now, if we click on it, we should see that image being displayed as well. Awesome. So this completes adding, uploading files to Supabase and storing those files in our database, and the ability to view the file's content by clicking on them. The last piece that we're missing is the ability to delete files and delete folders. Currently, our delete button does absolutely nothing. So we'll take care of that in the next video. Thanks a lot for watching. Bye.